So, good morning everyone and welcome to this symposium. My name is Anders Jönsson and I will share this symposium. Well, some of you may find it strange to organize a symposium on rubrics. You may think that rubrics is just another pedagogical tool, but then you would be wrong. For some reasons, rubrics have evoked much stronger emotions than most other pedagogical instruments. For some, rubrics offer the solution to almost every conceivable problem. They may also cure some common diseases, maybe. While for others, the use of rubrics may lead to the loss of your hermeneutical soul and eternal condemnation. So rubrics are not just another pedagogical tool. They are a living controversy, and therefore I must ask you in this audience to put your emotions aside so that we may speak to that objective, neutral, unbiased researcher that we know lives inside of all of you, so that you may listen carefully to these presentations about different perspectives on rubrics. And we have 4 presentations. They will get 15 minutes each, and then we will have a discussion. The discussion will be made through a Zoom link to Heidi Andrade, who's with us. You don't see her now, but I see her on this screen, and I will put her on that screen later on. But first out is a paper by Anna and Ernesto, and I therefore welcome you, Anna, from New York to Cali.
I do welcome intense emotion. I really like it and enjoy it. If rubrics elicits strong emotion, all the way. All right. So how do I operate this thing? Okay. Okay. So I'll start with kind of an unusual look at the rubrics. So I'm not going to present the study in which we looked at the rubrics in a kind of traditional way, when you present the rubric and then have students produce some kind of work and then do other wonderful things that you can do with the rubric. So there is a twist. So I'm leaving you with a cliffhanger at the moment. So we all come into this game. So the study was conducted by me and with collaboration with Ernesto Panadero and my student Terence Calistra. And generally, we research feedback, okay? So we research feedback that teachers deliver to students, that peers deliver to students, that are computer provided, and there is a lot of information. It's actually, I'm going to talk about this in a couple of hours. But here we are struggling to make teachers' life a little bit easier, all right? So we were thinking, is there a way to give excellent feedback and also stay sane? So we started wondering if we can use instructional tools in a way in which we would encourage students to generate self-feedback, all right? Because very often I would go to teacher professional development activities and I would talk about, this matters and that matters and this characteristic of feedback is really important and this elicits the right kind of emotion that you want. But then one of the teachers said, I have 120 papers to grade. If I try to provide detailed feedback on an ongoing basis, I will lose my mind. And I definitely can relate to that. There are those nights at 4 o'clock in the morning when you're sitting with your students' papers and questioning your life choices, right? So on those moments, I started thinking, how can we come up with a solution to this? There should be a way in which we would alleviate this load that we have upon us, and we can find a way, all right? So this was our attempt. So our goal with this research was to try to find a feasible approach to providing, we call it for now, standardized feedback, or having students generate feedback on their own. And this work on self-feedback was actually done by Dr. Andrade right here, and then Ernesto and Jacqueline Broadbent and we wrote the chapter in 2019. David Nichol calls it inner feedback. Suzanne Narcisse refers to it as internal feedback. So there is a lot of research that's being done about this inner feedback generation, or self-feedback, whatever you want to call it. So I'll stick with self-feedback for the time being. So in 2014, with my students, again, after one of those sleepless nights, probably when I was engaged with the papers of my students, I thought to conduct a study in my own classes. So I came to my master's class and we decided to implement the following procedure. So we conducted a small-scale experimental design study in the context of a course. So we had students write in a research proposal, and then we provided rubrics and exemplars to them, or a combination of both, and then we asked them to revise their assignment based on these tools. So in our case, rubric became this standardized feedback or a tool based on which students would generate self-feedback. And students in this case were randomly assigned to one of the 3 conditions. Rubrics, exemplars, they received 3, poor, average, quality, and excellent, and then a combined condition with rubrics and exemplars. So I'm jumping straight into the conclusion because this is not the main study that I'm presenting. This is like a preamble, exciting kind of preamble to get you. So we found the following results. These are the 3 groups: rubrics, exemplar condition, and the combination. So we found that the rubric groups did significantly better. And it was actually quite a shocking finding. And I'm usually quite careful with using this kind of descriptors, despite the fact that I come from the United States where everything is amazing. So this was a really shocking finding because rubric did so well. Like, what happened here? And we are talking about effect sizes approaching 1, which you don't see in the literature pretty much ever. So what we also found that the exemplar and the combination, exemplars and rubrics, they did worse than the rubric condition. But the exciting finding was that all 3 experimental conditions did better than the initial draft performance, which is already quite an encouraging finding. So, yeah, late flying. So what we found in this case, so the conclusions that we made, is that all 3 conditions led to improvement. That rubric condition obviously outperformed the other 2 conditions. So we explained that rubric facilitated better quality of self-feedback generation, possibly by reducing cognitive load. Because if you engage with exemplars, first you have 3 of them. Second, you have to extract criteria. Okay, Okay, so it's a lot of work for the student. And in rubrics, everything is explicated really nicely, levels of performance, criteria of assessment. And also, we had focus group discussions with the students, and students told us that they focused on the best exemplar. So they didn't even look at the average and low quality exemplar. And in the combined condition, they also didn't go for the rubric. They only took the best quality exemplar. And the phrase that they kept using, I tried to make my proposal look like the best exemplar. And also familiarity. We thought that students are generally more familiar with rubrics, so maybe we need to look deeper into that. And then since 2014, we were waiting and waiting for the perfect school to agree to work with us, because we were planning a more intense study, because in this case we also didn't have a control group, so there were some methodological questions there. So finally, we decided to do a study. We found a school that agreed to work with us. So we thought that if we train students to use rubrics and exemplars for self-feedback on 2 tasks. So here we had 2 rounds of write, revise, and resubmit, okay? So we could not only look at the effects of rubrics and exemplars on 1 task, we could also make some assumptions about transfer. Do students transfer what they learn on this initial task to the next task? And this is something that is missing in the field, so it's really hard to do this kind of studies usually. So we, in this case, could have our control group. So we had rubrics, exemplars, and a combination, and we trained students on how to use these tools. So our research questions. What are the effects of rubrics and exemplars on high school students' performance on a writing task? Does training on using rubrics and exemplar results in an improved and differential use of these tools? We had 206 participants from the 9th and 10th grades. The average age was 14 years. We had a nice distribution of genders, so we had about 51% male. It was a little homogeneous for a US school, but it was a private school, so, but we did have some spread. So the procedure for you. First, teachers introduced the assignment, and here they did present the criteria of assessment. So the criteria listed on the rubric were communicated to the student. But the reason why we didn't introduce the rubric of the exemplar in the beginning was because we really wanted to see how these tools work for self-feedback generation and as this form of standardized feedback. So participants received the explanation, then they wrote the essay, then they were randomly assigned to these 4 conditions, and then they received the corresponding tools with their condition, okay? Submitted it. Then we conducted the training. So teachers worked with the students, and I assisted, so we explained to the students how to use rubrics and exemplars and the combination for the feedback generation. We had a lot of examples. The control group, in the meantime, was working on study strategies. And then we went at time 3, we had a new task. It was a similar task, so students were asked again to write an essay, and again the process repeated. And then we conducted training with all of them and gave them the opportunity to revise. Okay, take a sip. So for the writing task, students were asked to complete an SAT essay. SAT is a standardized examination in the United States that students take to be admitted into colleges and universities. So SAT essays is aligned with Common Core standards. This is the curriculum that we currently use. Students were asked to read a passage and then write a persuasive essay. Okay? There were 3 dependent variables. So all SAT essays received 3 scores. 1 on reading, it assesses students' understanding of the passage. Then writing, this is your style, the basic style, grammar, punctuation. And analysis, which shows students' understanding of the author's use of evidence and how convincing students' arguments were. And so the experimental groups were control, rubric, exemplar, and then those who received both tools at the same time. The results. We found significant interactions, significant main effects, lots of simple effects, so it was one of those super exciting studies that you really want to get. So here is the summary of the results that I'm going to share with you. First of all, time 1 to time 2, right? We're looking at time 2, the revision. Once again, rubrics come on top. So there is something about rubrics that really allows students to use them, to look at their essay, to analyze the work that they already produced, and come up with good results, really implement and revise their work based on it. So rubrics came on top for all 3 outcomes. But then we conducted our training, and then here is what we see. We see that at time 3, this is the first draft of the second similar essay. For reading, all 3 groups do better than the control group, but they do not improve from time 1 to time 3. So their performance on the next task did not change. Whereas for writing, the rubrics group did significantly better than their performance, than their initial draft performance on the first task. Okay, so here we can already see the evidence of some transfer. So on the second similar task, the students who were in the rubric group in the first round, they performed better than their counterparts in the other 3 groups. And for analysis, all 3 groups did significantly better than the control and also did significantly better than their initial performance on task 2. So again, super exciting findings because evidence of transfer, this is something that we all want to see. We want to engage in a task and provide feedback and then see that students can actually use what they learned on this assignment to the next one. And then finally, the revisions in the second round, after training. So we see that for reading, rubrics and exemplars did better than the other 2 conditions. So we can see that exemplars already approached after training, the effect students could use exemplars effectively. For writing, rubrics still consistently stays on top. And for analysis, we also have rubrics and exemplars performing at the very top. So in sum, rubric groups performed better at time 2, but with training, exemplars group does well at 2 outcomes, for 2 out of 3 outcomes. The combined condition also improves with training, but less so than either rubrics or exemplars, and all 3 intervention groups outperform control group, which is, once again, a very exciting finding. So what does it all mean for us, right? So encouraging students to generate self-feedback using various instructional tools is a viable strategy and can save our time. And I'll show you a few more examples later in the day. Explicit instructions should be provided because in this case, again, with exemplars, we saw an improvement after this training. So students need to be taught how to use these tools efficiently. And there is evidence of transfer to the new task, so learning is taking place. So exemplars, rubrics, and other tools that encourage student self-feedback generation work well and have a potential of saving instructors' time. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And as you said, we will be listening more to you later on today. We'll see. Our next presenter is Juan, who has a paper written with some colleagues and also with Ernesto Panadero. You will see that he, at this conference, is something like the opposite of Voldemort. He's mentioned all the time. So, the floor is yours, Juan.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and Heidi, her here. So our research is about the effects on self-regulation, self-efficacy, and performance of rubrics and self-assessment scripts, conclusions from a failed intervention in a statistics course with 2 colleagues from Madrid and also Ernesto. I will start with this idea from the review on self-assessment from Heidi Andrade. Self-assessment is a practice that has been intensively researched, although given its complexity and multiple ways of conceptualizing and implementing it, imply that there are still many open lines of research on how and why it works. So for this research, we use, as I mentioned, scripts and rubrics. This is the first part of one of the scripts we used in the research. As you can see, it has 6 points, but the script we used has had about 16 points. And this is how a rubric looks like. Maybe you are all familiar with this tool. And we can sum up the differences in 5. First, the focus. While scripts are focused on the process and master skills, rubrics are focused more on the product and performance. Regarding the understanding of the tools, scripts are simple, but the cognitive demands tends to be higher with the use of scripts than with the use of rubrics. Regarding the use, scripts are developed in a step-by-step way. As you can see, the students can follow the steps provided to solve the task by the teacher, while the rubrics are, as they are focused as a whole, but with different parts. And also regarding grading, rubrics have a scoring strategy that the scripts don't. So regarding rubrics, there is a large and growing body of evidence on the use of rubrics. We found some positive effects if rubrics are used in a formative way, but the scripts research is scarce, and there are tools that are very similar to scripts, such as prompts and checklists. And also we checked that there is confusing terminology between prompts and scripts, because we read some papers regarding the use of prompts, but in fact they were using scripts and the contrary. We only found 3 studies from Panadero and colleagues from some years ago regarding the comparison of the 2 tools. I will discuss them in depth later. So our aim was to explore the effects of rubrics and scripts on second-year higher education business students, self-regulation, self-efficacy, and performance. And also we explored with quantitative and qualitative data how students perceive and use these 2 formative assessment tools. I will not present data from the students' perceptions and tools because the lack of time. So these are the research questions, as I mentioned, and in line with the aim of the research. So the study had a quasi-experimental design with 3 experimental conditions: rubrics, scripts, and control groups, with some dependent variables measured after the intervention, performance and perceptions, and 2 dependent variables measured before and after the intervention, that is self-regulated learning and self-efficacy. We had around 45 participants in each condition, and 2 things are important to mention regarding previous measure before the intervention. We explored some previous data from our students, and we got significant differences. The students from the control group overperformed the students in the rubric and the scripts groups. The students in the control group were much better than the students in the experimental groups in 2 variables: the academic record rate obtained in the first year, in the previous year, and also in the grade obtained in a very similar course that the students had in the previous academic year. So regarding the procedure, it's important to highlight that the teacher in this research had no experience regarding the formative assessment research or training, and she had no idea about rubrics and scripts. So we trained the teacher about formative assessment and the use of these tools, and we helped her to design, we co-created with her the tools we use in this study. In the first lesson of the course, we informed with the teacher, because we were present there, to the students, and we collected data from the first questionnaires. Also, in the second lesson, we, the researchers and the teacher, we asked the students to do a task with the tool in that group. So we explained about rubrics and scripts and how to use them. Then, in the following weeks, the students in groups performed the 3 tasks, but also a partial exam and a final exam, and then we collect data about, again, self-regulated learning, self-efficacy, and students' perceptions and use of these tools. I will present the research question one by one with the results and discussion. First, regarding self-regulated learning, we used 2 questionnaires. We did not find any significant results from both. We used the motivated strategies for learning skills questionnaire, and also we created a specific self-regulation questionnaire. As I mentioned, we didn't find any significant results, and this is in line with some other studies from Panadero. One of these studies, or 1 or 2, I don't remember, they used thinking aloud protocols, that is quantitative data, but also quantitative, and they got only significant results with these thinking aloud protocols. And this is in line with the meta-analysis from Panadero, Johnson, and Botella. So the conclusion was that when self-regulated learning was measured using qualitative data instead of questionnaires, the effect of self-assessment was larger. Regarding self-efficacy, only in the rubric group we saw that it increased significantly with the intervention. And taking a look at Panadero and colleagues' 3 studies regarding this comparison between rubrics and scripts, only in one study they found significant results about self-efficacy, only in the group who used rubrics, but also when the teacher provides feedback. Regarding the third and last research questions about performance, the students performed 3 tasks, partial exam, final exam, and we had also the course grade. So again, as with the previous measures, the control group obtained the highest and significant scores in the 3 tasks, the partial exam, and in the final grade of the course. Not in the final exam, but it was also higher. So, considering this limitation in the previous levels, and also regarding these performance results, we did a difference and indifferences analysis with multiple time periods to explore the genuine effects of the use of the rubrics or scripts in the experimental groups. So these were the different time periods from the previous subject in the previous year to the subject of this research, from the partial exam to the final exam in this research, and from the first task to the third task in this research, to see how differences change over the time. So, in addition, students were segmented by quartiles according to these 2 variables, this academic record grade and the grade obtained also in the similar subject in the previous academic year. So we could explore the benefit in the students. So regarding time 1, previous academic year subject grade to the final subject grade of this research, we found that in the rubric group, only for the students who had a very high academic record grade, we got significant results. In time 2, for the partial exam to the final exam, again with the group of rubrics, but only again with the students who had a very high academic record grade or an intermediate or a high grade in the similar course. And regarding the time 3, also for the rubric groups, but well, regarding the academic record grade for the total of the sample and the students again with a high grade. And also with a high grade in the grade they got in a similar course in the previous year. So this is in line with the study from Panadero and colleagues, but in this study they only compared a rubric group with a script group. They didn't have a control group. So for summing up this educational implication, future lines of research and some conclusions, both our results and those from previous research from Panadero and colleagues, who were the ones who compared the two tools, so the results are neither particularly positive nor conclusive. We can check many different regarding the task. For example, in our research, students perform this task in groups, while in the studies from Panadero and colleagues, they performed individually. Also, the type of assignments. In our research, I have to highlight that the task was difficult. Students had to solve some econometric statistical problems, but in other research, students, the task was easier. They had to analyze landscape or create multimedia materials for the students, and we consider that it was easier for the students because the rubric or the scripts help them more than in this study. Also, the type of the tools. There are tools like scripts and prompts, and they could be internal or external, focused on the content, on the knowledge the teacher want to teach. But also, these tools could be focused on collaborative skills. As from an analysis from Fogel and colleagues on external scripts, they got some results, such as a large positive effect on collaboration skills, but a small positive effect on concerning domain-specific knowledge. In the line of the presentation from Anastasia, well, we checked some research regarding the combination of tools. So there are some studies regarding the combined use of scripts with work examples, with some positive results, and also the same with rubrics. Also, video modeling could be another tool combined with scripts or rubrics with maybe positive effects. Also, feedback should be explored in combination with rubrics and scripts. As I mentioned, one of the studies from Panadero and colleagues found only positive effects with the use of rubrics when the students received feedback, but there were not significant results if they didn't get any feedback from the teachers. Also, in combination with self and peer assessment activities, and we have to, can explore more in the co-creation of the tools, while Engelmann and colleagues didn't find any significant, or even they found negative effects for the co-creation of these tools, I mean in prompts. We found certainly positive effects in the co-creation of rubrics. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Juan. And now, for our next presentation, is a paper from Margaret Bierman and Rola Ajavi from Australia. Rola couldn't be here today, but Margaret will give us the honor of producing it, presenting it, sorry. And where do we have it? It's there.
Well, good morning, everyone, and Heidi, in very morning to you. So my slides are supposed to look very beautiful, but you might actually find them just a bit faded. I'm talking really about the limits of transparency today, and this is a series of work, built on a series of work I've been doing with Roller over the years. And, you know, if you're interested, here are some of the papers talking about some of the ideas. So I wanted to talk, just open up with this sort of notion of transparency. We talk about transparency as if it's a good thing, and I think, in general, we can probably say that it is. It answers the question, how will my assessment be judged? And rubrics, and scripts for that matter, provide a means for representing assessment criteria. And what we do here is we say what these things do is they allow us to see through to the intentions of our teachers. We're making everything else transparent so you can see through. And I want to start by saying I think this is not a bad thing, because I've certainly had assessments, maybe because I'm a bit older, where people just sat in a room and decided what we all were going to get. And while that does rely on holistic professional judgment, at the same time, if someone doesn't like you, it can also be very influential. If you're not like the person doing the assessment, they can simply bring all that to bear. So I want to start off by saying I think transparency has a lot going for it. But it is just a metaphor, and I think the metaphor has limitations. Most particularly because transparency is a contested concept. Now, when it comes to assessment criteria, there are two myths that I want to say are myths. They're not true. First, that transparency is achievable, and there's been a lot of work written repeatedly. I mean, Roy Sadler's written about this. That knowledge, there is some knowledge that cannot/should not be expressed. It's too holistic, it's too tacit, it's too dynamic. By putting it into words, by nailing it down, you end up in a situation where you're trying to specify things and they somehow, the parts don't capture the whole. I think that's not contentious in some ways. Other issues about transparency, and I was thinking, well, Juan was talking, this is another issue, is that we often think that things are transparent because we're writing them and we're the teachers. But when you say, for example, as I have, to many research students with rubrics, I want to see a research proposal that is coherent. Well, coherent makes a lot of sense to me, but to them as the students, they don't understand what coherence means. So what it means is what is completely transparent to me, clear. Students don't understand, and the lower performing students particularly will struggle. They won't even understand the jargon that we're using in the rubrics. And the final point is making some criteria transparent means that others are opaque. We're selecting things, and therefore, by doing that, we're not looking at other things, even though they are important, and we will probably make judgments on them. They just don't somehow or other make it into the rubric. The second myth, and this is drawing from the post-structural critiques of neoliberalism, is that transparency is neutral. That's a series of jargon for you as well too. So the point here is that transparency in rubrics actually is an exertion of power. And this may seem, all very amorphous, but if you actually give it a little bit of thought, you go, yes, of course. It is how management prevents secret teachers' business. They do say you must assess according to the rubric, so it is a means of controlling teachers. It can be both good and bad, of course. Transparent assessment criteria are a means of controlling our students. We say this is what we want, we're exerting control on them, but, and I think this is more significant, is that actually gives them control over us. How many of us have had the student come to us with the rubric in hand saying, tell me why I didn't get an A. What is it that I didn't do? So they actually provide power. And finally, they have epistemic power. And I suggest the metaphor of transparency itself controls how students see knowledge. It makes you say that if this is what the criteria is, the knowledge can be nailed down, it's fixed, it's representative. Everything can be expressed. That's a little associated with the metaphor. I'm talking about metaphor here, not necessarily with rubrics. So transparency assumes that the rubric is a representation. It exists out there as a sort of object, neutral object that represents our intentions as teachers. But what if we change perspectives? I'd like to argue that from a different point of view, the rubric is not neutral or something to be achieved, but an active participant in the assessment process. And Rolla and I have written extensively about this, and if you want a lot of science and technology, you know, Latour and Moll theory, you can go to those papers or talk to me. I get very excited. And the key point of this is that the rubric and the student enact the criteria together. A standard or a criteria or a rubric is a performance. It's not just something that's sitting over there, it's a joint activity. And when you start thinking about a joint activity, then you start to get away from the metaphor of transparency. And after many, many weeks of argument, and I can't remember what the old metaphors were, we settled on this metaphor, invitation, alternative metaphor for rubrics. And we liked invitation because it comes to some of the point with feedback. You know, you can offer something, an invitation, but someone can refuse it. It's not something you must do. We're kind of asking students, please, please, come play with us. And so this metaphor shifts what the rubric says to saying, please, what can we do together? We're asking students to join us, or join really, not even us, to take the rubric and join in activity. So, what might we be inviting students to? And you can see some other rubrics, you can think about it. You can think that rubrics actually prompt students to work with criteria. They offer opportunities for meaning making. And you're talking about the self-assessment. That is the meaning making that we're offering. And we get away from the granularity. They can deal with holistic, dynamic and tacit concepts because we're not trying to pin them down using this metaphor. We can think of a text as promoting learning activities. Text that promotes studying, thinking, regulating, interacting. You can prompt a student to make comparisons to reference, like Exemplars, peer work or quality standards. You can put that in your rubric. And we argue that the invitational metaphor fits the developmental purpose of the rubric better than the transparency metaphor. So I'd like to propose 3 ways in which we might employ the invitational metaphor to help us think a little bit differently about rubrics. The first is to invite the students into a productive space. And I think this is the most self-evident, and you might actually say in some ways, good rubric writing possibly uses this metaphor anyways, and I'm very comfortable with that. But it takes us away from the issue of being explicit enough and asks how the rubric leaves enough space for the students to contribute their own ideas in their performance. And when the teacher is writing the rubric, rather than saying, what can you put down that represents what the task is, you can say, well, what can the students contribute when they work with this that allows them to perform the criteria in a developmental way? How can the assessment criteria be written in a way that invites them to do so? Now, this all sounds a little bit amorphous. So here's an example. We, in review for this paper, they said, we want examples. So we went online and found some published rubrics. And I wanted to use these because I didn't want I wanted to use rubrics that were seen as decent, good. They didn't have to be exceptional. things that are in practice. That's what my interest is in, what people actually do. And this is one about a lab report. It says graphs, charts, tables. It was a rubric. It had some grading associated with it, so I think it's a cross between a script and a rubric. Are all relevant figures included? Are figures and axes labelled appropriately? Do they only ever contain appropriate information? Are the tables redundant with figures? Yes, no questions. Have you not done this? Very representative. We had a go at turning this into something that might be more invitational. How do charts, graphs and tables align with the conventions of lab reporting, labelling and formatting? How question, not a yes, no. We ask them. The rubric hopefully invites people to go and check what the conventions of lab reporting are, so they're not being told what they are. How can you accurately represent the data in easily readable format? And again, the rubric here, we're hoping, is inviting the students to think about what accuracy means and what easily readable means. And we stuck with accuracy because accuracy is important in a scientific discipline. It's just a quick example of the flip. Here's another one that we found, a criteria for excellence regarding the premise of a philosophy paper, and I thought this one was already quite invitational. You can see here, it says in the middle, the papers provide sub-arguments for controversial premises, and you can see here the rubric is doing a few things. It's actually suggesting that you might want to include a controversial premise, but if you do so, you need to provide good arguments about it. And the premises which are taken as given are at least plausibly true. What I like about this rubric is even the language of it is coming at the sorts of language that you would expect in philosophy. It has that sort of fold to it. So rubrics often have these invitational qualities to them already. It's a question about highlighting them, and particularly in this first area of saying, how can we invite students in to a productive space where they can contribute themselves? This is the sort of thing that we already think about in good rubrics. The other thing that we can think about is about how rubrics work with tasks. So something I'm quite interested in is assessment design, and I'd like to suggest that thinking as an invitation means that we can invite the students multiple times, to the rubric multiple times. A lot of the, in our life, we mostly say, here's a type of assessment, and we'll offer the same assessment on different topics, possibly with the same rubrics, iteratively. What if we kept the content the same, but actually varied the task and kept the criteria the same? And we actually do this a bit intuitively, but I'd like to propose it's a really useful way to think about criteria. So, for example, in the research proposal course that I taught, same criteria, same task, but multiple versions of the task. It might be a debate, it might be a discussion, it might be a small piece, but we can actually alert students to thinking about the criteria as the task goes on. How is your enactment of the criteria changing? How are you building your understandings of what coherence is? And the final point, which I'm hoping I've got you to at any rate, is to invite sophisticated ways of knowing. So, asking students to reflect on how they've responded to the task, asking students to describe the relationship of their work to the task. It moves from a rubric as a grade justification to asking students to mount their own rationale for their work. And it moves away from knowledge as being fixed to understanding it can be done multiply. The rubric isn't a source of truth. It's something that I interpret, and it's something that I work with in this work, and I change how I think about it over time. So, all metaphors have their limitations. The transparency and invitational metaphor, I believe, can exist side by side. But the invitation metaphor avoids the challenges of achieving transparency, and it embraces the active position. It embraces the fact that a rubric has power and it can be exerted. So, back to the symposium.
Thank you. Can't believe that everyone is on time. Excellent. Well, the next presentation will be done by myself, and let's see. and you will not be surprised to hear that I've written this with Ernesto. And what we've done is that we've made what we call a critical review of the arguments against the use of rubrics. So we can trace the start of this study back to, oh, I forgot, I left out the year here. Maybe it was in 2016? Yes. Okay, so we had this presentation at another SIG meeting, and we presented some work that we did on rubrics, and we were met by, anger. So that is why when we started thinking about this as rubrics as definitely not neutral instruments, but very emotional instruments. Here's the one, the Symposium. We wrote a chapter for a book by David Carles. And my own background in rubrics is that once upon a time, very long time ago, we made this interactive tool for assessing student teachers, what should I say, their ability to decode and analyze classroom situations, difficult dilemmas, and we used these kind of short movies that student teachers analyzed, and we had to have some way to assess that. So, we looked at rubrics as a way of doing that, and now you know about rubrics, but just in case, you know, rubrics is that you have different aspects or criteria on the one hand, and you have different levels of quality on the other. So that is how a rubric works. And for the work that I did, we were very interested in the reliability of rubrics, because if you try to assess something so messy as analysis and reasoning, well, you have to have something to hold on to, and we looked at rubrics, and we did this review on rubrics in 2007. And we saw that, okay, if you use rubrics, there are different ways that they can be improved by increasing reliability, but also there were a few studies that showed that rubrics could aid in improving student performance if you shared the rubrics with the students. So there are some buts to this. Providing students with a rubric only, not teaching them how to use it, doesn't really make anything happen. Not all studies demonstrated this improved student performance, and there were not so many studies at that point. But we came back to this when the number of studies had increased, and we could see that by communicating expectations in the way of rubrics, it could reduce anxiety among students, it could aid the feedback process, and it could support student self-regulation somehow. And this could be affected by many different variables, which made it quite complex. But we tried to bring all these things together back in 2016 and presented reasoning about how to construct rubrics for formative use. And this is kind of a model that we've used to talk about this, how transparency, sorry, Margaret here, but what we try to provide is that students know about the expectations, and that may affect how they handle self-regulation. It may affect how they receive feedback and things like that. So when we presented this, we were met by some critique. That, for instance, as you can see here, that rubrics cannot capture the full complexity of real-life performance. It can lead to what is called criteria compliance, by Harry Torrance, used that expression, and that analytic assessments, that when you pull things apart from the holistic assessment, then it's quite artificial. And in some, that rubrics may do more harm than good. So what we wanted to do after this was to bring all this critique together to see, okay, what is this critique? Where is it coming from? And what is it grounded in? Is it grounded in some kind of empirical findings, or what does it come from? So we set up these research questions. What are the main areas of criticism? To what extent are these claims supported by empirical research? And is there empirical research that talks against this critique? So we wanted to look at both sides. So we did a database search here in Spain. And we found a number of journal articles and one book that had this kind of critique. We didn't use peer review as an inclusion criterion, as you see from this book, for instance, because we wanted to bring all this critique together. And from this, we did this content analysis, different kinds of critique, and we found 93 different excerpts with critique. And we did a thematic analysis on those, trying to bring them together to different themes about critique. And the last one, search for empirical evidence, called 2 steps here, is that, okay, that if they provide critique, do they also provide empirical evidence? If not, do they provide references to such empirical evidence? And in that case, we go to the reference, and if they do not, we go another step to the next reference. And actually, in some cases, it went in some kind of a loop. It went back to the original, so some of them were quite circular. So here are the themes. I won't go through them in detail, but you can see there are issues about standardization, narrowing of the curriculum, the criteria compliance, again, but simple implementations, just handing out rubrics, don't work. Limitations not of rubrics in themselves, but on the assumptions that they build upon, such as criteria and analytical assessments, and also context dependence. So I will just show you from this one. So if we take this theme, limitations of criteria and analytical assessments, you can see that there are subheadings within that. There is no precision in criteria, analytical assessments of individual criteria are not valid, no list of criteria is complete, and so on. And we looked at this empirical evidence that they made reference to, and there was, as I write here, varying degree of empirical evidence. There was one theme that was clearly backed up by empirical evidence, and that was the one about simple implementation doesn't work. There were a smaller number of studies providing empirical support for some of the claims, but not all. So the criticism was largely based on anecdotal evidence, theoretical speculations, or extrapolating from broader issues. For instance, that it's not good, grading is not good, thus rubrics are not good either, because it's connected to grading. There were also a lot of very deterministic claims. You see here is that any attempt to codify academic standards is futile. It's a necessary condition that criteria are conceptually distinct from one another. Some criteria can only be tacitly known and are impossible to articulate. So it's very strong claims made in some of these articles. And also that when being informed about the criteria, learners will almost inevitably try to meet these criteria with minimal efforts, this criteria compliance, which is, as I show here, one example of empirical evidence showing that this is not really the case. It's more nuanced than that. Well, yeah, some students do that, but others do not. Also, another grand theme in this critique is that there is a way of assuming that the worst will happen if you hand out rubrics. The rubrics will focus on surface details in order to increase reliability, include quantifiable levels of performance, like scoring, some kind, and that this scoring will then be summarized at the end or bottom of this rubric, which is, if you look at the rubrics out there, is not really true. So our suggestion in this study is that, well, instead of being so deterministic and closing the door for empirical investigations, maybe we should continue to look at this through scientific inquiry and base our decision on such data and more nuanced visions instead. Instead of making assumption about rubrics with this very narrow conceptualization in mind, we could start doing more distinctions between different purposes for using rubrics, how they are used, how they are designed, etc. And instead of making this question of using rubrics just black or white, you could, as I think that Margaret is proposing here, is that make students more aware of this conditional nature of indeterminacy of criteria, and yeah, they are indicators of quality, but they are not dictating what the students should do, but you could have some kind of a negotiation about what they actually mean. So if you are more interested in the other themes, you can find out more about this in this publication. So that's my presentation. Thank you. And now, to the most critical part of this symposium, I will try to change so that Heidi does not only appear on this screen, but on this one. So, cross your fingers. That's one step. There's a sound also. Okay. Let's see.
Good morning.
What do you know?
Bravo, Anders. Thank you.
Do you hear us as well now?
I do.
Great. Then I would like the other presenters and Mr. Panadero to come up and join me here. Please take a seat. So, very much welcome to you, Heidi.
Thank
We're
you.
very glad you can be with us, although we know that it's in the middle of the night over there in US. And I hereby leave the discussion to you.
All right. Thank you. I'm going to start my timer. I want to thank you, Anders, for organizing this symposium, not just once, but twice, because of the symposium, because of the pandemic, and for making it possible for me to participate virtually, even though this is not a hybrid conference. All right, you can see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, here we go. Okay. All right. The aim of the symposium, I think it has been met. Your goal was to bring together different perspectives on transparency in assessment and how students use it and are affected by its use. So congratulations on that. What I intend to do is make very brief comments on each paper. I'm happy to share my PowerPoint and have side conversations, although not over coffee, sadly, with the authors at some point. But I have this idea I really want to share with you. I'm presenting it as a challenge. It's a challenge to me as well as to all of us here. And then if there's time, some questions, comments, and discussion. So first, the brief comments on each paper, and I'm going to go out of order. I'm going to start with your paper, Anders and Ernesto. And there's a lot there, not surprisingly, that I heartily agree with. And two of the things, these second two bullets here, anticipate the challenge, which is related to making our rubrics focus on our curriculum and our learning goals. And so, and the one thing that I want to, one concern I had about the paper was that on page 3, where you had design recommendations for rubrics, there was no mention of learning goals or standards. It's always assumed, right? And so this sort of foreshadows my challenge to us as a field of researchers, to foreground our learning goals. I'm going to get to that in a minute, but for now, I just want to point out that in this paper, as design recommendations, learning goals, standards, that sort of thing are not mentioned. Okay, next paper. Juan et al. A very ambitious study. Bravo for actually collecting data, as did Anna and her colleagues, in real classrooms with real students. That's very difficult to do. I also really liked the fact that the paper focused on the self-assessment and self-regulated learning aims of rubrics instead of just measurement, which is going to come up again in a minute. I have a question about this research in general, though. Given the very different purposes of rubrics and scripts, why are we comparing them? It's not a competition, right? Why not create a model of learning that includes the roles of both rubrics and scripts, one product, one process, making them complementary to each other and empirically testing that model? I'd love to see that happen. Also, I was concerned that the reliability indices for the MSLQ and the SSRQ were not good. And there was no evidence of the validity and reliability of the teachers' grades. For that reason, I actually felt sort of cranky and justified in not even reading the results from those measures. It's odd that the MSLQ, which has been used so much, had low reliability indices, but it's very concerning. And I think that it might be related to your surprising non-findings, right? So, but you didn't mention it at all. It's as though you need to be concerned about the validity and reliability of those measures and look at why maybe you got some low reliability. But in the meantime, I don't think you can draw conclusions about that. I think all you can say, based on those measures, all you can say is, we don't know, we can't know why we got results or no results. We just can't know. That has to be set aside. I also needed a lot more information about what the two co-authors told students about what rubrics/scripts are and how to use them. I can't really interpret the results without knowing that. And then back to this competition thing, I skipped a bullet, so I'm going to go back up one. There, you had some really great qualitative data in the questionnaires that I thought could enlighten us about how and why students use rubrics and scripts, but because you made it a competition between the two, you're just comparing the two. I think some things were lost. If you go back and look at that data in terms of what it tells us about process, what students are telling about process, that could be really valuable. Okay, next study. All right, unraveling the effects of rubrics and exemplars. I'm stealing this idea about a post-study session with students. I know you didn't make it up, but for some reason, this made it stick in my head. I, of course, very much appreciated the information on inter-rater reliability for the essay scores. I know it was only 18% of the sample that you could calculate inter-rater reliability for, but it's better than nothing. Question and challenges. All right, Anna, you knew this was coming because I warned you. You wrote that research has shown that handing out rubrics just for self-assessment after the draft of an assignment has been completed is beneficial, and you cited me, and I have never done that. I won't do it. In fact, those two studies that are cited there, I handed out an exemplar. We co-created criteria. I handed out the rubric based on that, and then they did a first draft. I don't get the justification for having them do a draft without a rubric. I think what you just said in your talk is that it's so that they can self-assess, but they can self-assess if they get the rubric first too. I do think that because you did that, you ended up with some great pre-test scores to show equivalency between your groups. But other than that, I don't understand why I think it needs a stronger justification. All right, I also wondered why you trained students only after they had already used the tools once, because using the tools will have idiosyncratic effects on the students, especially if they haven't used those sorts of tools before, that you can't control. It might make your results hard to interpret. I wondered if you did a power analysis. Oh, I meant to ask that of Juan too. Especially Juan, since you started looking at your subgroups in terms of the highest achieving and stuff, I'm not sure you had the power in your, given your sample size, in order to do that kind of analysis. All right, students, this is something that I noticed in Anna, in your paper that I don't think you picked up on, or maybe I misinterpreted it. Students in the rubric group actually got better scores for reading, writing, and analysis after being given the rubric, but worse after being trained to use it. And I wondered, how do you explain that? Was the training really bad? Was it, what? I don't know, but you didn't tell us what the training was, just like in the other paper. I don't know what that training involved. What did you even tell them? So I can't interpret that result. Then I think you make, at the end of the paper, you have 5 implications, and I think 2 of them are too broad. One is that students working on a complex task can benefit greatly, and you don't mention anything about self-assessment. Would you please put that in the title of this paper? You don't mention, in that implication, you don't mention, you say just revision, but the control group also revised and did not improve. It's not the revision that should be encouraged. It's the rubric and or exemplar and self-assessment with those. And then finally, you mentioned that students did not have time to use both the exemplar and the rubric. 50 minutes to learn a rubric, read 3 exemplars, and revise to have a improved final essay. That's not enough. You acknowledge that in the paper, but then you have this implication that says that it's overwhelmed. It's not overwhelmed. I think it was just not enough time. So try it again, give the students more time, and see if you have a different outcome. All right, blazing through. Margaret, lots of claims with which I heartily agree, including that criteria can promote and constrain activity, and that they can prompt students to develop their own ways of working and learning. I want to challenge your claim that, especially with complex, authentic pieces of assessment, students often find it difficult to understand the expectations, and teachers find it impossible to articulate what these expectations are. That sounds perfectly reasonable to me, and I know that it's partly true, but I also know from working with arts educators, dance, theater, visual arts, and music in New York City for over 10 years, that when we focus on learning goals, it gets much easier to teach students the expectations related to the learning goals, and for teachers to articulate them, right? It's not easy still, but it's doable. So here I'm going to get to my challenge. I have noticed, and I'm saying our definitions here because this includes mine, but where we are now in the field, I'm starting to sort of step back and look and say, what have we been doing? What can we do differently? Our definitions, including the definitions in the papers here, focus on the measurement of performance quality and not on mastery of learning goals. Okay, I do it too. This is how my definitions have been. Some of these definitions here of rubrics cite me, right? So I'm just as guilty, but I'm just trying to push us forward a little bit. Okay, so notice lots of performance, lots of quality, performance quality, evaluation. Juan and Anna, in your papers, you actually defined rubrics in terms of their features, not their purposes. So I would like to go back to looking at the purposes and then have the features come from that. And what I think we need to do is focus our rubrics on the learning goals. All right, why do I get all worked up over this? Again, back to the arts work, arts education and assessment work that I've been doing. I had a conversation in a group of visual arts teachers once a few years ago, and this is my favorite example of why it's really important to look at the learning goals. This teacher came to us. She had been doing collage work with her students, and she was really disappointed with the results. It was uninspired, it was uncreative, it was bleh. And we said, okay, what are you telling them your expectations are? And one of the things her rubric said was that they need to use 3 kinds of paper in their collage. And we said, really? Is that what your learning goal is? And she said, well, don't be ridiculous. My learning goal isn't that they should use 3 kinds of paper. My learning goal is that they should make paper choices that enhance the textural and expressive subject of the collage. And we said, why don't you put that in your rubric? She's like, well, of course, that's what I should put in my rubric. When you say, you get what you assess, right? So if you say 3 kinds of paper, criteria compliance, they put 3 pieces of paper on and think they're done. If you say, make paper choices in your collage that enhance the textural and expressive subject of this collage, are students going to understand that? Yes, because that is your learning goal. That is what you are teaching. That's the pedagogy, the instruction, the curriculum, right? And that's what it needs to say in the rubric. So when she did that, she came back to the group and said, now I have artists. I have students thinking like artists instead of just sticking 3 pieces of paper. All right, so what we get when we focus on learning goals in our rubrics is less standardization, a good steering effect, less criteria compliance and inappropriate coaching, and a more dynamic, I'm drawing on the Behrman and Ajawi article right now, a more dynamic rubric that can cross context. All right, so let's say we do just, this comes up a lot for me and came up in this session too, because the College Board rubric that Anna et al. Used is a measurement rubric. It is a summative rubric used by the College Board to judge, to evaluate. It is not intended to teach or learn. So, and look at the difference, right? So it's cohesiveness, always, sometimes, rarely, never, which I think we should never use when we write rubrics, right? It's not useful to students. It doesn't invite them into the learning goals. It doesn't even make the learning goals transparent. And just as contrast, I'm sharing with you a piece of a rubric that I wrote for a diagnostic assessment that gets really descriptive about what cohesiveness means, at least on the paragraph level. So they're different, right? They're not really comparable, but I just put them up here to contrast one that's very measurement oriented with one that's more learning oriented. And I think we can assume that students are going to learn more from the bottom one than the top one. But that needs to be tested. So I said, all right, Heidi, put your money where your mouth is. See how your own rubrics measure up. So, first the definition, sorry. I reordered my slides. All right, so given this idea about focusing not just on measuring, but on making our rubrics an invitation into the learning goals, I challenge us to think of rubrics in a very different way and to define them in a very different way. So the 2 bottom bullets with the little check marks there are my attempts to define rubrics in a way that puts the learning goals at the forefront. Just 2 little drafts for us to consider. So how about, instead of a rubric is an evaluation tool that has criteria and 4 levels of quality, how about if a rubric describes how well a student's work demonstrates mastery of the learning goals for that work? Or a rubric is a document that reveals the learning goals for a task and describes varying levels of mastery of those goals. Okay, probably not too objectionable, right? And you might be thinking by now, so what? So what, Heidi? What difference is this going to make? Well, I think it can make a difference in like this, but I also wanted to see if it would make a difference in my own work. So I'm going to skip this slide. Looked at my own master's level course on assessment. And this is just an excerpt. It's a 3-page rubric because I have to write a long paper. And I thought, well, how am I going to get my learning goals in there? All right, I could stick them on the side under the criteria, right? That feels just sort of stuck on. So what if I actually incorporate them into the rubric and I've got them at the highest level here, which is the 2nd column in italics. Okay, again, they're just sort of stuck in there. Does that create an invitation to the learning goals for students? Maybe. And then I realized I was sort of forcing it because I wrote my rubric with the learning goals top of mind, right? The rubric already reflects my learning goals, and that's why it's 3 pages long, because you need more words. I think this is a design issue, right? So I think we should be encouraging rubric writers to think about the learning goals as they write their rubrics, to put them at the forefront, to make learning goals or standards the #1 design principle. This is not a new idea. Sue Brookhart, oops, I put her middle initial, sorry, it's S. Sue Brookhart has been writing about learning targets and success criteria for a long time. I think we just need to embrace it as a field. And I also hope that we do so and create some very cool new studies. So I'd love to see research that compares a performance-oriented rubric, maybe like the SAT one that we just shared with you, with a learning goal-oriented rubric, and then get a really fine-grained measure of learning and self-regulation with evidence of validity. I predict the learning goal-oriented rubric will increase learning-oriented SRL strategy use. I also hope we'll have a measure of anxiety following on Panadaro's research, and even a measure of epistemic beliefs after consultation with Margaret and Rolla. I also think we need some validity studies of learning goal-oriented rubrics. I also wonder what role scripts can play in inviting students to engage with the learning goals related to a task. And finally, please, if nothing else, if and when you do professional development training for teachers, stress the need to start with learning goals and the standards, not just a measurement of quality, but what are we trying to teach with this rubric? As what are we trying to teach with the task that it assesses? All right, that's it. What do you think?
Thank you. Yeah. How do I do this now? Can I? Yeah. Well. So first, I will ask anyone here in this panel if they have anything to add from this discussion.
I don't even know where to begin because there is so much to say and there is so much echo. So there is a lot to say, and Heidi, yes, the paper is...
I can't hear you.
Okay. Do this instead.
The paper that I presented has been accepted to the Journal of Experimental Psychology, applied, so we did do power analysis, I assure you. I think you misinterpreted some of the findings, so there was no dip, no decrease in rubrics performance, significant decrease in rubrics performance. Maybe it looked like this on the chart. And okay. Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Is that better?
And I think we only have 6 minutes and I have to run to a different presentation. So I don't know, Ernesto, if you want to take over with the rest of the critique, but methodologically, again, I assure you in terms of the analysis, everything's fine, power is checked.
Yes, she is muted.
How can you mute?
Yeah, but if we take away this one, she won't hear us. So I don't, but I can't. If you turn off those, maybe. Is this better?
I think this is better. Yeah, I'm not doing it.
Okay.
Good.
Again, the final statement, with our study, our goal was to use rubrics and exemplars for the purposes of feedback, self-feedback generation. So it was, think about it as a, it's not quite basic research, it's an applied research because it can directly be taken to the classroom, but at the same time, we are really trying to disentangle the effects of these instructional tools and see if individually or in combination, they can work to improve students' revisions. If students can use these tools to generate self-feedback, and if they can improve this performance. So we can certainly in the future do studies where we administer rubrics in the beginning and then compare to those when we administer rubrics after they produce the initial results. And there is evidence in the exemplar work that when you show exemplars in the beginning of the task, students do not improve as well as they do after they submitted an assignment, and then we present them with the exemplars. It's just like feedback. You don't provide feedback in the beginning before the students produce some kind of work. So this is the logic that we followed in this case, and I think we achieved our findings. And Ernesto, I'll leave it to you, and I'll have to excuse myself and start.
Yes, Anna is running away here because she's having another session in a short while. Do you want to respond to this, Heidi?
No, she and I will talk about it later. I'd like to hear from others.
We have a question from the audience, and I have no idea how we are going to do this. But if you speak up, maybe it will work.
I originally would have had a question to Anna, but she but now I just do highlight. So you created a tension between quality performance and reaching learning goals, and I did not understand that. Because if students reach learning goals, then they perform in a high quality way, right? So this is one way of quality of performing down, reaching learning goals. I would understand you if what we mean by performance quality is normative performance in terms of a comparison between different students' performance. Then I would understand you. Maybe you would be able to clarify. And I also didn't quite understand why you argued that you should look into the dynamics of students learning all the time, but groups not well suited to do that. I would disagree with that, but maybe you could explain that also a bit more detail.
Heidi, did you get the question? No, I think the first question was that you make a distinction between looking at quality of performance versus learning goals, and shouldn't the quality of performance, if the quality is good, then you should meet automatically the learning goals. Is that a correct interpretation? It's nodding.
Sure, technically, it should work that way, but if we're thinking of rubrics as teaching tools and not just as measurement tools, and we want it to be transparent and we want to invite students to engage, then why wouldn't we make certain that the goals of the learning are emphasized in the rubric? And the rubric has to be grounded in the learning goals in order to be considered valid. So why not make the learning goals transparent? Why not invite students into the learning goals? We can use rubrics to measure, to assess, to grade, and they work that way. But I think everybody in this room believes that rubrics can do more than that. And in order for them to do more, we need to focus them on our learning goals.
Can I respond to that, Agnes?
You can respond if you do it very quickly because we only have 1 minute left.
Okay, so I just wanted to say that it seems to me that this question of learning goals and quality, and taking from the example that Heidi gave, was they will revolve around the same point, around whether you go for something that's, you spoke about the difference between the texture and the expression, the three uses. It seems to be coming to the same point about how we express quality. And a learning goal is one way to prompt teachers to actually express something meaningful. And I think this is something we're struggling with, everyone's struggling with in this whole conversation about how do you find the right granularity about what is meaningful and then how to put it in a rubric. And it just strikes me, it's just a really nice way of asking people, what do you want them to learn? Because then they go, so I don't see, I'm really with you. I see it as a way in rather than sort of a dichotomy, but a really useful one. So thank you.
Yeah.
There, it's 11 o'clock. So now you may return your emotions and discuss this over coffee. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Thanks again, Anders.